throughout the last 100 years, I would say, there's been of research on leadership. 4 perspectives have emerged. The first one is the one that focuses on the personality of the leader. It's sometimes called the leadership trait theory. And essentially, it started at the beginning of the 20th century. The idea was that leaders are special people who have abilities that the rest of us don't have. So they have personal characteristics that make them stand out. And so psychologists try to identify those characteristics, and they came up overall, like there was a huge list of traits that they explored. For example, people wondered if height was correlated to leadership. Right? Are taller people more likely to be leaders? And most likely, even though there's been some studies show that CEOs, for example, on average are taller than the average population. Overall, when you look at the list of leaders throughout history, height is not a factor. And you always have counterexamples, like Napoleon, the short inferiority complex, that maybe creates like the desire to be a tough leader. The only physical characteristic, which I don't have in the list here, that has been correlated is physical attractiveness. So people are considered to be physically more attractive than the average and more likely to be thought of as leaders. But beyond that, those 6 traits matter the most. So the first one is drive. So leaders tend to have a higher than average degree of drive. They have a high need for achievement. They are highly ambitious. They are very energetic. They have tenacity. They usually take initiative. They're the ones who propose things, who think about doing new things. Right? 2, they tend to be motivated to be a leader. So I'm curious, how many people in this class feel like they have some motivation to be a leader, some degree of motivation? Okay. Not everybody does, right? There's 2 types of motivation that have been identified in the literature: personalized versus socialized. So personalized motivation is when you want to be a leader for the perks that it gives you. So power, Churchill said power is the most powerful of aphrodisiacs. That's an example of like one of the perks of being a leader is it gives you access to more romantic adventures. But beyond that, money, fame, power over others, respect, all of those things are things that people want with power. Socialized motivation is when you don't really care about those personal perks, but you want to change society. You think that you have to be in power in order to make a change in society. So those are the examples of that would be Gandhi, Mother Teresa, Pope Francis. We've heard Pope Francis, in fact, refuses the perks that come with a job. As an example of showing I'm not after the personal power of being Pope, but I want to change the world instead. Yes?
What about Hitler?
Well, it's interesting. You could have both. I mean, I think Hitler had both. Well, you think about, he really wanted to change, I think, his society. He wanted to make it better. He believed that his vision was good for Germany. And I think he implemented that. But I also think he enjoyed the perks of being in power. So you don't have to, they're not mutually exclusive. You take somebody like Steve Jobs, interestingly, actually, I think Steve Jobs was really more like in the socialized kind. Because he didn't care about money. Steve Jobs had a lot of money, and at some point he had a mansion in Silicon Valley that he never lived in because it was too big, and his house was not furnished, was half furnished because he didn't care about that. In the book, if you read the story, he would go on vacations occasionally to Hawaii with his Larry Ellison, his friends and CEO of Oracle, and they would fly in Larry Ellison private jet and go on his yacht, and the children of Steve Jobs was like, oh, we're going on vacation with our rich friends, even though Steve Jobs had much more money, but he didn't use it. He didn't have a yacht, he didn't have a private plane, he didn't have a big house, he didn't care really about any of that. He wanted to change the world, So later in life, he relented a little bit, but so, you have, those are 2 potential motivations. But certainly Gandhi, Mother Teresa fits the socialized theme. I think, I don't know, I would say, I'll talk about my sense of politics. I think Donald Trump, cares about the perks that come with the power. I think more than changing society. That's my belief. But maybe you're welcome to disagree with me. So I think you have people who are more interested in what the power brings them. To some extent, you could say something like Arnold Schwarzenegger, was interested in the perks that came with power. Although, I think he did a fairly good job as governor. So 3, honesty and integrity. Leaders tend to have honesty and integrity. What's interesting is when you talk about evil leaders or so-called evil leaders, like Osama bin Laden is a good example, right? To most Americans, think Osama bin Laden is unethical, that he's behind the terrorist attacks, as far as we know, of September 11th. But I would say to his mindset, he's not evil. He's fighting the cause that he believes in. He's protecting the people that he identifies with. And he's taking legitimate military action, or the kind of action that he thinks he can undertake against what he perceives as an aggression that's by the US Army in the Middle East, right? The attack of the West on Islam, as he sees it, as just a legitimate retaliation or just protection against that. So, in fact, what's interesting, very few people know really about bin Laden other than the perspective that the media in America has portrayed of him. If you looked at his personal life, he was actually very self-sacrificing. He was very humble in a way. He was kind of austere, lived a very austere life, gave to a lot of charities, Islamic charities, and was quite principled, And when you look at the messages he sent, they made sense, They were not like raving maniac kind of like speeches. If you looked at whenever there were tapes from Osama bin Laden, they were never translated. The message was never delivered as what he actually said. It was just more like, another crazy tape from Osama bin Laden. But so I think honesty and integrity is very subjective. There's this quote that history is written by the victors. So the one who win legitimates their leaders as good and the losers as evil. And we always tend to think that the person on the other side is evil and the person on our side is good. But in general, I would say there's honesty and integrity. I would say, even with, in the case we were talking about Hitler, I think Hitler was honest and had integrity in his vision. Now, of course, we don't, if you take a wider sense of against racism and against the sort of like killing other humans, then it's not, it doesn't fit with our integrity. So leaders tend to have self-confidence, including emotional stability. So emotional stability is when you are, it's very important to realize, so leaders are very good at expressing their emotions, but to a certain effect. So they're good actors, They can summon their emotions for a particular effect. But other than that, they're not overcome by their emotions in a way that makes them out of control. They tend to have higher intelligence. They tend to be experts in their domain of expertise. Okay, so we didn't really talk too much about the second column here. We had only one aspect of it. But one question that was asked, started in the 30s, in the 40s, research in leadership asked, what about the situation? So this first column makes it seem like it's all about the leader, that leaders who have those characteristics will always be good leaders. But are there situations that tend to make a leader? And an interesting fact, if you look at political leaders of the 20th century, who are the political leaders that we remember the most? And you will find that often it's like the war presidents, war leaders, right? Who do we remember the most? So we were talking about Hitler. Apart from the two German students we have here, other people in the room, can you name who was chancellor in Germany before Hitler or after? Most likely not, right? We remember, we remember Roosevelt as president, but who was president after Roosevelt and before, right? Okay, so, we remember Churchill, who was prime minister in England after Churchill and before Churchill, right? You might know about Charles de Gaulle, who was president in France before or after. We don't know. So what's the characteristic? War, adversity, catastrophes, big situations like that tend to have an effect on whether a leader emerges or not. Right? So in a way, it can be somewhat of a blessing to face a catastrophe if you're almost in a leadership position, because that can make you. Yes?
I'm just going to say, there's the quote, you have greatness thrust upon you.
Uh-huh.
Like that. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, can you say that one more time?
It's like some people are born great and some people achieve greatness, but some people have greatness thrust upon them.
Right.
It's kind of like that.
Yeah.
Or you have to.
Yeah. There's this notion articulated by Warren Bennis, one of the researchers in leadership, that he talks about crucibles. What he calls crucibles are defining hardships that you go through that forge your character. So if you don't die out of this experience, or if you're not crushed by the experience, adversity builds your character, and great adversity can make you a leader, can really make you realize that you're more than just this isolated person in your life, but that you're part of a greater whole, and gives you a sense of grip on your destiny. Right? So it can happen in near-death experiences, failures of a particular kind, rejections, facing injustice, whatever it is that you may face can make you a leader. So, but what came out of this was this. So the leader situation match theories. So some researchers asked themselves, how does a situation influence leadership? And what came out of this was the idea that leadership is not just about the leader, but about one, the situation, and two, the characteristics of the followers that are available to a leader. Now think about if you were put in a leadership position, like you become a department manager of a department. Now you're a manager. There's a whole discussion about is management and leadership different or similar? And I would say they are different. You can be a manager without being a leader. You can be a leader without being a manager. So you don't have to have formal power to influence people. Like you can be a civil rights movement leader. You don't have formal authority over. Martin Luther King didn't have authority over anybody, but people followed him. Right? Jesus didn't have any formal authority over his disciples, but they followed him. Now, you can also be a manager and have authority over people, but they might not think of you as a leader. They might think of you as the manager, right? And sometimes you have people who are both. I think somebody like Steve Jobs was both a leader and a manager, right? So important to distinguish the two. So if you're in a management position and you want to be also a leader, what this theory tells you is that there are two leadership styles that you can adopt. One is the authoritarian approach. You can think of it as the stern father or the bad cop approach. And the other one is the democratic leader or the good cop or the motherly, loving mother style. So General Patton, for example, would be a great example of that. To some extent, Steve Jobs would be an example of that. Certainly, a lot of dictators might be an example of that. And then you have this style where this would be more like Gandhi, Mother Teresa, and such examples. So which one works best? According to this approach, in crisis situation, what people crave for is an authoritarian leader. So, you're on the Titanic and the Titanic has just hit an iceberg. How do you want the captain to respond? Do you want the captain to say, hey guys, let's have a meeting and decide what we should do? No, I want to make sure that everybody expresses their thoughts. So let's vote and debate this thoroughly, because I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. So anyway, I want a consensus to emerge. No, you don't want that. You want the captain to say, shut up everybody and do what I say, because this is a crisis and you follow my orders now. So that's definitely the type of leadership that works best in this situation. Also, if you have followers that are not skilled or motivated to do a job, being authoritarian works best. you're the leader of a prison work party. You know, you take prisoners to go work and pick trash on the freeway. You know, the authoritarian approach in this case, you know, should work better. This works best when you either have skilled or motivated people and you are in routine situations. So you are the head of a group of researchers that works on finding a cure for cancer. You can imagine that the people who work for you are motivated, they're smart, they will respond better to a democratic style than an authoritarian style. You know, this kind of like relates a little bit to what we talked about when we talked about creativity yesterday. In fact, I was adding nuance and saying, well, this style can also work in those situations. So it's a little murkier than presented. So, okay, so what's the third column? The third column is an interesting point of view. It's a provocative perspective. It's a perspective that says, well, okay, so we looked at the leader, we looked at the situation, and to some extent characteristics of the followers, but let's focus even more on the followers. So the term followers is used when we talk about leaders. Managers have subordinates, leaders have followers, right? Essentially, what happened, so you had a researcher at Stanford called Jeffrey Pfeffer who did a study of CEOs and the impact, the financial performance of their organization, of their company. And he was curious in finding out can you quantify the impact that CEOs have on the financial performance of their company? Right? If leadership is important, you would find that the actions of the CEO, the leadership of a CEO would have a big impact. And what he found, he did a study, how do you call it? A meta-analysis of various studies, and found that essentially the correlation between CEO's action and the financial performance of their company was 0. He was very surprised by that. So since then, there's been other studies that have contradicted that. So it's, you know, science keeps evolving. But that led him to think, whoa, so that means that really leaders have no impact on the performance of their country or their company. Right? And that led him to articulate the attribution theory of leadership, which essentially says leadership is bogus. It's bullshit. It's not, leaders are not special. It's only the reason we have leaders is that followers need to believe in leaders. That's kind of like the idea is that we are all suckers for believing in magic. It's like we want to have the idea of an all-powerful person who knows what to do. Kind of like, so, you know, wanting to continue to believe that mommy and daddy are kind of like know better and are special than us. Right? So the reason it's called attribution theory is that it's of leadership. It's based on a theory in psychology called attribution theory, which looks at how we derive causality. And the idea is that we tend to attribute causality to what stands out, to what is salient. So for example, to give you an example of what that means, if you give a party at your house and you find at the end of the party that your wallet is missing. Right? So who do you suspect? In your process of elimination, of trying to attribute causality, right, you might notice, there was one person in my room that at the party that I had never met before. Everybody else I knew. Right? Who are you likely to suspect? Most likely that person, right? How do you decide that? Because they stand out. They are salient. What stands out is what we tend to attribute causality to. So leaders are people who stand out. And because they stand out, we tend to attribute more power to them than they actually have. So to go back to the table, if people start believing that you have special powers, that you have magical powers, that you're anointed by God, that you are, that you're not like the rest of others, that you're more often right. So Patton, so that's how legends are born. Patton stands up on the field and never gets hit And the legend starts to appear around him that when you're with Patton, you're not going to be wounded, right? And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people believe that you're special, then they will fight harder because they think you're special. And they will win more often. And so it has, so leadership has an effect in so much as people believe in it. There's this expression in I think it's in sociology, right? Even if something is not real, if people believe in it, then it's real in its consequences. So if I believe a leader has special abilities, even magical powers, if that's not true, nonetheless, if I act based on that belief and take more risks, it's kind of like the placebo effect in a way, then the consequences of my beliefs are real, even though what I believe in itself is not real. Make sense? So I have a great example of that. So the king of France at some point wanted to get rid of the authority of the Pope. So the Pope had authority over kings because he would anoint them as kings. He had to, at their coronation, he had to anoint them. And so if he didn't like the policy of a particular country, he could refuse to, threaten to excommunicate them, which happened with England. But he could also refuse to anoint them. So that created a sort of politicking problem. So the French came up with a great idea, which was that a dove came from heaven and carried a little vial of oil that was to be used to anoint the King of France, right? And they kept this vial and they used a pin to anoint the King of France. And the idea is that you could bypass the Pope because you were anointed directly by God, right? Now, if you believe in that, that gives a lot of power to the King of France. I think it's bullshit. I think, there's no dove that came from heaven and brought a vial of oil, but people believed in it. It created a belief that gave power to the King of France. Right? So that's an example of attribution theory. What this tells you essentially is that being a good showman or showwoman, acting the part, dressing the part, all of those uniforms, all of those symbols that exist. Why do generals have fancy uniforms? Why did kings have batons and how do you call it? Crowns, right? Why do stars dress in a particular fancy way? Why did Einstein have his crazy hair? All of those things are sort of in a way, fitting the stereotype of what people want to believe. And if you fit the stereotype, that gives you power. And it might be completely untrue. Kind of extreme perspective.